Welcome everybody, and thank you for your patience. We're trying to make sure that we take care of the people who are joining us outside of Zoom as well, so that they can also be a part of this through streaming through Facebook. So we want to make sure that they're able to access this. So we have our wonderful IT person who is helping to make that happen. But I am going to get started by introducing myself. My name is Jane Kofi, and I am coming to you from Northern Virginia. I live about 30 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. I am currently a curriculum and instructional designer for the Center for Responsive Schools. But before I joined the center full-time, I was a classroom teacher. I've taught pre-K through 5th grade for the past 20 years. And then my co-host, who enjoys singing, Joe, take it away.
I do enjoy singing. It's just no one enjoys hearing it. That's the thing. So I'm Joe Tilley. I work also full-time with the Center for Responsive Schools. Like Jane, I'm a curriculum and instructional designer. I'm located here in Nashville, Tennessee, and so that's where I'm coming to you from. Prior to going to work full-time for the Center for Responsive Schools, I worked in the classroom as a special education teacher for several years. I've done both elementary and middle school, so I've worked with grades from kindergarten to 8th grade in both pull-out settings as well as push-in and co-teaching inclusion settings, as well as I've had some district level positions where I was in some support roles and some special education district level positions as well. And so that's a little bit about me. And with that said, I will pitch it back to Jane.
Hey, before we keep moving forward, I want to make sure, Chris, are we good to go? Or do you need
We should be good to go.
Thanks, Chris. All right. So welcome everybody. We're really excited to have everyone here. We have such a large group, which is super exciting to have so many people here to be able to share this information with and to be able to brainstorm and connect with others as well. Before we jump into the content that we're going to cover today, one thing we want to do is make sure that everyone feels comfortable with the platform that we're using. We know that there are people who are very familiar with Zoom and have probably used it for months now, and there's some people where Zoom might be a little bit new or a newer platform. And just so that we're all in the same place as we continue this learning today, I am going to take a moment to point out just a few features very briefly so that we're able to access those easily. One is mute and unmute. You'll notice that for some people, your toolbar is located at the bottom and it's there and it's pinned, and some people you may have to click or hover for it to appear. It might be located at the top, and for some people it actually can be located on the side. You're going to make sure that throughout our time together that you remain muted. There'll be some opportunities at the end where if you have a question, we will ask you to unmute to share your question. But for now, to make sure that everyone can hear the content that Joe and I will share with you, I'm going to make sure that you remain muted for this time. The next feature is being able to start or stop video. It would be great to be able to see everyone, but we do understand, like, it might be a situation where you feel more comfortable with your camera off, and that's fine too. And also, if you're comfortable with your camera on, feel free to share that so that we can see and make connections that way. Most of you have located the chat feature, which is also on the toolbar. There are going to be opportunities for you to put things in the chat box. While Joe and I are sharing content, you might find that the chat box is limited to just sharing questions with Joe or myself, so that we can respond when we're able to, or make sure we can scroll back through to find those questions. Also know that while we're presenting, we may not see your question right away, but we'll do our best to be able to get to your question. And if you find that it's buried under many comments, feel free to put it back in there again. And then one other feature, if you find that there's something that resonates with you or making a connection with, feel free to use the reaction icons. For some people, depending on the version you have that feature on your toolbar, and for others, you'll find that feature within the participant feature tool on that icon. And so you'll be able to click on participants and you'll see a number of features that you can use to react to different things. Before we jump into our content, it's really helpful to be able to find out more about one another. And we're noticing that so many of you have shared and felt comfortable sharing in the chat box where you're from and your role and what you're doing in your building. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper to find out a little bit more so we can all see that, because sometimes it's a little tricky to scroll through all that information. And so the people who are joining us live and the people who are within this community on Zoom will be able to see that information and also make connections that way. It also helps Joe and myself be able to get a better sense of all the people we have with us today. And so to do that, I'm going to share a poll with you. In just a moment on your screen, you'll see a question. I am going to read the question and some of the responses so that people who are joining us through Facebook will also be able to add their response through the comment feature that way too. And so your very first question that we're going to share so we can find out a little bit about who we have with us today is about your role. And many of you had the opportunity to share that in the chat box, but you're going to just share your role by just clicking one of the responses that you're an administrator or a school leader, you're an elementary educator, a middle school educator, a specialist, a resource teacher, or maybe something that we don't have listed here. And you can type that in as other, or if you're commenting, you can do that way too. So I'll give us a few moments to respond to this poll. And if the poll is there in front of you, you can use that feature and just respond that way. Or if you're joining us in a different way, where you're not able to see that, you can do it through the chat box or comments. So I'll give you a few moments and I'm going to share the results so we can see who we have with us today. Give you about 10 more seconds. And then I'll share our results so we can see who we have. All right. So I'm going to end the poll so we can see. And if you want, you can add your comment into the chat box if you weren't able to. So we have an idea of who's joining us today. This is what it looks like for our group. We have quite a few elementary educators. We've got some administrators and school leaders, some middle school educators, some specialist resource teachers, and some people who are in a different category other than the ones that I just shared. So we're going to find out a little bit more and find out the amount of knowledge we have with our group today. So you're going to share your number of years in education. So you can share, it's been 0 to 3 years, 4 to 6, 7 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, 21 to 25, 26 to 30, or more than 30. So take a moment if you feel comfortable and add to that, either using the comment feature, chat box, or you can do it right in the poll so we can find out a little bit more about the knowledge we have with us today. I'll give it like 10 more seconds, and then I'll share the results. All right. So it looks like we've got a wealth of knowledge with us today. So people who have a lot of experience in various areas, and people are here and sharing some of their experience and getting experience and knowledge from others, and that's going to be helpful. We're going to take 2 more questions to find out a little bit more about our group. And this one is about your familiarity with either morning meeting or responsive advisory meeting. So maybe you've used morning meeting before, or you've used responsive advisory meeting before, which is sometimes called RAM. You've used components of either one of those, or it's new to you, not yet used it. So take a moment and either you can add in the chat box or comment feature so we can see that, or directly on the poll. I'll give you a few more moments to do that. I'm going to share the results so we can see people's familiarity with each of those practices. We have quite a few educators with us today who have used morning meeting and are familiar with it. And we've got educators who are familiar with responsive advisory meeting as well, or use components of either one. And a few that this will be a newer practice that they're looking to find more information about. The final one is about what the school year is going to look like for you. So as we're thinking about the focus of our time together, it's looking at those two practices and how we're going to adapt them for what the school year is going to look like. So thinking through your school year is going to be in person, virtually, it's in person and virtual. If your district or your school is still determining that, or if it's something different than those. And you can either put those in the comments or right onto the polling feature or in the chat box. So we have an idea of kind of where everybody is. I'll give you a few more seconds to add a comment if you feel comfortable doing that. All right, I'm going to share the results so we can see those. Right. We've got quite a few people with us today who are going to be doing a combination of in-person and virtual. And so hopefully as we gather today and we go through our content, you'll be able to see how we're going to adapt those two practices to help support you either virtually, in person, or a combination of both. And so you can start thinking through that. So that being said, I want to share with you the goals of our time together today. So take a moment and just read over those goals and just make a note to yourself about what you really want to focus on or what you're really interested in so that we can start that with our time together. With these three goals in mind, the hope is that we're going to go through this agenda so that we're able to meet those goals and to share this content with you. So with that being said, and this being the agenda that we're going to follow today, our main focus is to really think about how we can use the two practices of responsive advisory meeting and morning meeting to support students in feeling that sense of significance and belonging, and creating a safe space for students to feel like they can take risk and take on challenges, but then also creating a space where every student feels included and feels significant in our classroom spaces, whether that's virtually, in person, or both. And so in order to do that, we're going to ground ourselves in what the responsive classroom core belief states. So I'm going to give you a moment to see that and read over it. And then I'm going to speak to how we're going to think through that and use that to carry us throughout our time together. So take a moment and read through the core belief of the responsive classroom approach. Let me give you some things to think about. With the core belief of the responsive classroom approach, the idea is that we want to create this optimal learning condition in which all children are successful, in which all students are included and seen and heard, and where all children feel safe and successful and able to take risks. And in order to do that, students need to have a set of skills, not just in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom. And these are the skills we want students to be able to practice, to be able to strengthen, and the skills we also want to teach so that students can be successful in these areas. So with that in mind, here's a question I want you to think through. If these are the skills that we want students to be able to practice, that we want to teach students so that they can be successful, I want you to consider your specific role, the students you work with, the community of students that you work with, thinking about what you know about the school year. So perhaps you know you're starting virtually, or perhaps you know that you're starting in person and virtually. Thinking about that, consider this question. So what are some of the skills that you feel like I'm going to need to address these in order for children to feel that sense of belonging and for every child to feel included in this space? Take a moment and think to yourself, which of these skills you feel you're going to need to address. I'll give you about 60 seconds to think through that. So as you were thinking, you may have isolated one particular skill and you may have thought, I really think that students being empathetic is going to really help them as we start the school year. Or maybe you thought, you know what, the skill of being cooperative or persevering is going to be really important. And chances are you probably thought through all of them and considered all of them as being things that are really important for students to be successful. The idea is, regardless of whether or not students are going to be in person or whether it's going to be virtual, the idea is the responsive classroom teacher uses the core belief to create an equitable and inclusive environment for all students. So that means if we're thinking about our school year that's coming up, the chances are there is a lot of information that's unknown. So it's unknown for students, it's unknown for families, it's unknown for educators, but there are things that we do know and that we know are best for children. And if we keep that in mind, regardless of whether it's in person or whether it's virtual, the idea is that what we want to do with students, the skills we want them to learn and to have, and the ones that we want to teach and the conditions we want to create don't change because it's virtual. We still want students to be successful. We still want to make sure every child is included and feels a sense of belonging and significance, and that the situations that we're creating for students are as equitable as possible. And so in order to do that, we want to think about what practices help to support that. And so the powerful practices of the responsive classroom approaches morning meeting and responsive advisory meeting allow for that to happen. It creates an equitable playing field for all children to be able to access and be able to learn and feel safe, and to start the year and set a tone that allows for that to happen. So in thinking about both of those practices, we're going to spend some time thinking about if these practices help to create equitable situations for students that allow students to feel a sense of belonging and significance, how do we adapt them then to allow for this to happen? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we might adapt morning meeting for the virtual or in person or a combination of both, and how we'll adapt responsive advisory meeting to allow for that in the classroom. These are the goals of morning meetings. So I'm going to give you a moment to look over these goals. And then we're going to use this to kind of ground ourselves to speak to how we can think through a morning meeting and how to make that available in a way that allows all students to be successful. So take a moment and read over the goals of morning meeting. The idea of morning meeting is to create a space in which students feel safe, where it's a positive setting where they can start their day and be in a tone and a space that is set up to create a climate where children feel like they can trust one another, that they can trust the adults in their space, but then also where children feel like it's okay to take a risk, and it's also okay to make a mistake. And so we want to create that environment by using the components of morning meeting to start the day in a way that allows students to feel that way. So using the greeting, the sharing, the group activity, as well as the message to be able to create an environment and a climate that allows students to feel comfortable and to create an environment where all children feel that they can be successful. So when we think about that, here's some key questions I want you to keep in mind. So if the idea is that no matter the setting, virtual, in person, or a combination of both, we want students to feel heard, we want students to feel included, and we want children to feel safe, that is the focus we want to keep at the forefront of our minds. And with that focus at the forefront of our minds, the next question is to ask, well, then how do I create a morning meeting experience that keeps that at the forefront, that keeps the thought that these are the skills students need, these are the skills that I'm going to teach, as well as this is what's important, so that it creates a climate where students feel safe, where students feel they can take risk, and students feel successful and included. The next part, question 3 and question 4, specifically speaks to your unique setting. So if you know that it's going to be in person and you have to put certain restrictions in place so that it can be in person, how do you create the experience that still has those goals in mind and allows for students to still feel included and still feel successful and still feel safe in that environment, whether it's in person or if it's virtual? And then the other part is considering those other pieces that make it equitable for all students. That means thinking about where your students are developmentally, but also what might you need to model so that all students can be able to access whatever pieces or whatever component you put into your morning meeting. To help us kind of think through that a little bit more, we're going to take a look at a morning meeting group activity component in a 6th grade class. They are doing the activity number freeze. And in this particular activity, you're going to see that it's not set up for what it would look like if it's socially distanced, and it's not set up virtually. But our thought is, if this is the activity that keeps these goals in mind and it's supporting students, how do I then adjust or modify it? So in this activity of number freeze, you'll see that students have the opportunity to stand up at any point in time, but they can only stay standing for about 5 seconds and they have to sit back down. The leader has chosen a number and is trying to kind of see about when that person feels like that's the number of people standing, and we'll say freeze, and then count and see if they have made that number. So with these questions in mind, specifically focusing on question 3 and 4, I want you to think about this activity that I'm going to share with you and how might you adjust it for your setting.
Go. Freeze. I don't know what you're doing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Good. We got it. We got it. All right. Have a seat. Have a seat. All right. Who wants to be? Who hasn't done a leadership thing for a while? All right, Jonathan, you can do this one. So again, we're going to start with 1 minute. We're listening for Jonathan for the number. When you're ready. So you gotta tell us the number first.
10. Freeze. Oh,
that was good. Good work. All right, have a seat. Who wants to go this time?
So with that morning meeting group activity and just seeing that little snippet of what that looked like in a classroom where we're not thinking about the setting being virtual or 6 feet apart, some things to keep in mind if we're thinking about that third question, the setting, and we have the goals in mind. We know we want students to be successful. So now we have to think about, so if this is my setting, how that might look. So if it's virtual, for example, I might decide that I will have students stand up or sit down. But if I have a wider screen or if I'm not able to see all the children, it makes it a little bit trickier. So maybe the idea, if I'm doing it virtually, is to allow for students to turn off or start or stop camera when they're standing, or start camera or stop camera when they're sitting. And then I might say freeze. And so if you're visible on the camera, those are the numbers that I count. And if not, those are the people who would be the people who are sitting. And so I might do that activity that way virtually. If it's in person and say I don't have space to create a circle big enough to allow students to stand far enough apart, I could have students just do it in the space where they are. I want to be mindful to have them turn and look around so that they're seeing the other students in the classroom and in the space, and they can still do number freeze in that way. If I'm doing it in a way where I have students who are kind of live streaming in and I have students right in front of me, I'm going to be the one who's going to pay attention to both, and maybe I'm the one who leads it. And after I've modeled it for a few times, I may have other students lead and I have to teach. So how do you watch what's happening here as well as in the classroom so that you can pay attention to what's happening? When we think about the other considerations, I'm definitely going to have to think about what do I need to model, but also what is the age of my students? Are all the students going to be able to do this particular activity successfully? Do I need to have parameters for what number they can choose? If I have 20 students, might I pick numbers between 1 and 20? Or might I pick numbers between 1 and 10? And I might have to explain to students why we're doing it a certain way over another so that they can understand. The other thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about students coming back into our classroom after this particular situation and things not being like they used to be or normal is that you might have students who may not feel comfortable participating yet. And meaning that we have to be okay with that. I mean, it gives me an opportunity to check in with students to see, okay, how can I help you feel comfortable in this particular activity? Maybe it's just raise a hand and maybe it's not stand up or sit down. Maybe it's raising a thumb or lowering a thumb so that all children can feel like they can access and be a part of this activity in a way that they're most comfortable. There are many ways that you can think through to adjust this for your setting. And I want to give you a moment to think about what you might do for an activity such as number freeze. So take a moment and just independently think about what might you do if you were using the group activity number freeze in your setting to make sure that all students feel included, but also all students are successful. So I'll give you a few moments to think about that. I can see a lot of people thinking through things just like in the chat box about how they might do that and how that might look. And people are just giving some ideas of, I could use the raised hand feature and that would be a way I could do that if I can't see all students on the screen, or I can use the reaction features. What we're gonna do now that you have a few ideas that you're probably, that are swirling around in your mind, is you're gonna have the opportunity to talk to others. So you can brainstorm, so you can troubleshoot, but then you can also think about how you might make that work and see how that's most helpful for what your particular setting will look like. All right. So in just a moment, you'll still be in our Zoom room and you'll have the opportunity to chat with a few other people in a smaller group. So you can think through how you might adapt a group activity such as number freeze in your exact setting. You'll chat for 5 to 6 minutes and then you'll be part of the large group again. And then we'll have an opportunity to hear about how that might work when you're thinking about keeping those goals at the front of your mind while thinking through a responsive advisory meeting. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully in your space, in your smaller group, you had an opportunity to chat a little bit and kind of brainstorm and come up with some ideas that still keep the goals at the forefront and ways to make sure students are successful. And then thinking specifically about your space, whether it's virtually or whether it's in person or whether it's a combination of both. And then also thinking about where students are developmentally to make that a situation that's successful for students. What we're going to do now is have the opportunity to think still about how we keep those goals as our foundation at the forefront of our minds as we consider responsive advisory meeting and how we can support students in being successful with that particular powerful practice as well.
Thank you, Jane. So the next piece that we're going to talk a little bit about is the responsive advisory meeting. And it is the middle school structure that we use to do many of the same things that morning meeting does. And we're going to talk about the parallels, we're going to point them out. But one thing that struck me was in the very beginning when everyone was doing the polls, I noticed that it seemed like an overwhelming majority of individuals are doing both in person as well as virtual. And whether or not that is all students in on Monday and everybody home on Tuesday, or half your students in on Monday while the other half are watching from home. We recognize, Jane and I recognize, the Center for Responsive Schools recognizes, we all understand the challenges that are associated with that. And so what we're hoping is that as we're talking through this, we can give you some additional structures to help with that. And when it comes to the middle school piece, one of the things that we have designed is the responsive advisory meeting. Now, this is approximately about a 20-minute period that students spend with an adult, and it's the same adult daily, so that there's that consistency. It's the same group of students. And it can happen at any time during the day, but it is designed in order to do the three goals that are listed. So what we're attempting to do, very similarly to what morning meeting does, is building those positive, meaningful relationships, developing positive relationship with peers, and then providing a safe place for students to strengthen academic, SEL skills, explore interest more, and then nurture development of new skills and talents. This is that opportunity for them to even learn from other individuals, whether it's adults or it is students. New things. And the important part to this that is, I think, always important to keep at the forefront of this is the fact that in middle school structures, in middle school designs, we often have math class and science class and English class and those types of things structured. And so when a student goes to the 50-minute block for that particular content, when do they learn the skills needed for that? And so that's what we're going to be kind of talking about as we go through this. And so as Jane laid out so beautifully at the very beginning with the core belief and the competencies, it's always important to frame these conversations recognizing that social emotional competencies as well as academic competencies are big picture ideas. They're big umbrellas. And underneath those are skills that are associated with those bigger umbrellas. And those skills can look different from place to place and from teacher to teacher. And so it's always important to remember that you have to teach and interactively model those skills. So let's talk a little bit first about what RAM is, why we do it, the purposes behind it, and then we're going to talk about the pieces associated with it and how we adjust that for kind of the new virtual piece as well as the socially distanced classroom. First and foremost, one of the most important things to remember is that the responsive advisory meeting is intended to be an equalizer for students. When they come into their responsive advisory, what we are doing is setting up a time throughout the day where when they leave, they're going to feel successful because the things that they're going to be doing while they're in there are not predicated on anything that they were supposed to have learned from a content perspective. And when it comes to the social skills, we're going to make sure that we teach those explicitly so that they can be successful with those as well. The purposes of RAM, there's 7 identified purposes. I'm going to go ahead and let these be present for us and just talk briefly about all of them. As I'm talking about them, though, I do think it's important to remember that these are still important. They're very critical, but they have also, some of these things will have changed because of the new virtual aspect. For example, building student-to-student affiliation. You no longer may have the ability for 2 students to sit at their desk and discuss their likes and dislikes. And so we're gonna have to think through how to build new affiliations, but that's what this is intended for. Supporting academic readiness, talking through those skills sometimes that don't get talked about in content standards-based learning. For example, why homework is important, why it's important to study for exams, so on and so forth. Strengthening advisor-advisee relationships. If you've ever worked with middle school students, you know they are growing into being young adults, and sometimes that can create some issues around their connections with adults. And so this is an opportunity for them to be able to connect with adult and have a positive relationship. Developing communication and social skills, such an important thing in the world around us. But in particular, it's really important now that we're in a virtual world. And so communication and social skills, that's changed because you're going to now have to teach sometimes chat box, and you're going to have to teach students how to speak clearly through a mask or a face shield. And when are those things going to be talked about? When are they going to be practiced? And when are they going to be discussed? And this is an opportunity to do that and not take away from content-based learning. Energizing and re-engaging students, it allows students after extended periods of learning or exhaustive periods, maybe state testing, getting them back engaged in the learning process. Reflect and recalibrate. This is that opportunity to talk about things that may be going on that are important, but not necessarily are appropriate to take away from standards-based instruction. And so these can be things such as unkind words being spoken to one another, unkind relationships being noticed, bullying that may be occurring, or it may be something on a larger scale. Perhaps a bathroom was vandalized, or there was a food fight in the cafeteria. These are things that can be talked about and not take away from other times. And then lastly, being able to extend learning through themes. This is a really interesting one because you can extend learning in the way of you could incorporate other grade levels after you have built all of these other pieces. Maybe there's a student who has a really strong interest in something else, but there's not that many people in that particular advisory group that has that same like. And so that's one of the ways that you can do learning through themes. Again, the important piece to remember here is these are the purposes. So when you're designing your advisory meeting, you're thinking in terms of why am I going to do these things? And it's all going to be contained within those types of things. The advisor's role when conducting the advisory meeting is always important to remember. First and foremost, you're going to set the tone. And so you have to really think in terms of that. I think that we're all going to be feeling the effects of online learning or distance learning or just being socially distanced in a social environment. And your tone is going to really impact the way that other people are feeling safe and secure and significant, and whether or not they're feeling like they belong. The other thing is to remember that you need to establish what the rules, the procedures, the expectations, what the activities, expectations, and procedures are going to be, and you're going to want to interactively model that. I think it's always important to pause here and remind everybody that, and this is, I think, going to be incredibly important when it comes to online learning or distance learning, social distance learning, whether or not they're in the classroom. Remember that there's a lot of things that go on inside of school. There's a lot of things, excuse me, that go on during a Zoom meeting for your math class that are not replicated in other places. So you want to make sure that you are always setting what the expectation is, modeling what that expectation is, so that students can feel comfortable in meeting what those expectations are. So let's talk a little bit about what the overall structure is to the responsive advisory meeting, and then how do we adjust that for virtual learning or for a socially distanced classroom, or perhaps a combination of the two. For those of you that are familiar with morning meeting, I think that what you will see are a lot of parallels to the two things, because the overarching idea behind both of them is still true, in the fact that what we want is for strong relationships between the adult and the students to be developed, as well as developing these skills that are associated with these bigger competencies. So to begin with, we have the arrival welcome, which is very similar to the greeting and morning meeting. And the arrival welcome is just that you are welcoming students. Now, in the new reality, I think that what we are going to see is that gone are the hugs, the handshakes, the fist bumps when we are inside of school. And I think that we're just going to have to be very honest with students about that. The other piece to this, I think, is going to be an interesting one in the fact that if you are wearing a mask and your students are wearing a mask, it may require you to raise your voice level in order to be heard, especially if you are also 6 feet from that person. And in the responsive advisory world, typically the educator is standing at the door as students are entering. And so therefore you also have the hallway clatter and noise that you may be contending with. And so I think it's just important to be transparent with students, because you don't want to be so loud that it intimidates them, but you want to make sure that when you're greeting them by name that they do hear that, so that they know that you are setting that positive tone and you're recognizing who they are, and that creates that safe space to get them started with. From a virtual standpoint, you can do the same thing. Jane was modeling it as we were coming in, and she was doing such a wonderful job of that. If there wouldn't have been so many people on this particular meeting, we would have done so by greeting you all by name. It was impossible to do it here, but if you have a virtual class of 20 or 30, then you can allow them to enter, and then you can greet them by name. The second piece is the announcements piece, which is very similar to the morning message piece in the morning meeting side of things. And what this is it's something that is displayed for students that prompts not only their thinking, but it gives them some type of positive action to take. And that can be something as simple as them thinking about what they wanted to do, or the announcements or the message that was projected by Jane on the very first PowerPoint slide encouraged you all to tell us what you did and where you were from in the chat box. And so that modeling will show you exactly how you can do that from a virtual perspective. The third component of the responsive advisory meeting is the acknowledgements component. And this is very similar to the sharing that goes on in morning meeting. Oftentimes during the acknowledgements, students are going to be, if they were inside a classroom and there were no limitations to what they could and couldn't do, they would be broken up into groups of 3 or 4, or even in pairs. And they're given a topic, or they're given a prompt to discuss with other individuals. It could be something that is not academic related, such as, when you have free time, what do you like to do? And they share that with one another, but they do so by greeting one another by name. And so if Jane and I were doing this, I would say, hello, Jane, the thing that I like to do in my spare time is, and I would answer that, and then she would respond back to me. In a socially distanced classroom, you can still do this. The key to remember here is you're going to have to talk to your students about the fact that the tone, the volume, I should say, not tone, the volume is going to be raised. And so there's going to be it's going to be more noise around them. If they're wearing masks, it may be something that they're going to have to be even more loud than they would normally be, but they're also going to be 6 feet apart. And so you just have to think about that. You can still do this. You just have to be prepared for how it's done. Interactively modeling this is going to be absolutely critical for success. The other piece would be the virtual piece. If, like in Zoom, you have the ability to put people into breakout rooms, then you can do that. You can give them the prompt, you can send them into breakout rooms. They can be in pairs, they can be in trios, they can be in groups of 4, they could even be in groups of 5. You give them the sentence stem, you give them the prompt, and then you let them go and talk with one another so that they can make connections and they can be seen and they can see others. If you are in a situation where you're using a platform that doesn't allow the breakout rooms, then what you would want to do is to try to figure out how to do some type of acknowledgement that would be it it would eventually turn into a whole group acknowledgement, but you still want that opportunity for them to acknowledge one another. The last piece of the responsive advisory meeting is the activity piece. And this is going to be a whole group activity that is similar to the group activity on the morning meeting side. And what you can do here is just think in terms of what is my purpose and what are the limitations versus what are the opportunities for me. What we're going to do is to show you a video of an activity that is done pre-COVID. So there's no precautions taken here. But this activity is one where students are being prompted by the teacher to try to say a number that they're counting upwards. And so they're trying to say a number and then just keep counting upwards without saying the same number as somebody else. And so as you're watching this, I want you to just think in terms of how could this be appropriately adapted if all my students were in the classroom and we were having to do socially distance learning, or perhaps I've got both a virtual group and an in-class group, or I've got just a virtual group. So thinking in terms of what would that look like, what would the needed adjustments be, and then we'll have some conversation around it.
I will give you guys 3 attempts. Remember, idea of the game is you close your eyes. Each person says one number. All right, you get as high as you can. Try and beat the high score of 37. We'll see how you guys do. All right, everyone close their eyes. Not yet. Ready? 0.
1, 2,
3. Nope. That was 2 threes. Ready? 0.
1, 2,
3. All right. One more try. Let's see if we can get past 3. Ready? 0.
1, 2, 3, 4,
5.
6, 7, 8,
9,
10.
11,
12.
13,
14.
15,
16. 17.
18,
19. 20.
21,
22,
23. 24. 25.
26,
27. 28. 29.
30, 31,
32,
33, 34,
35.
36,
37. 38. 39.
40,
41.
42,
43.
44,
45.
46, 47, 48,
49. 50. And I'm going to stop it right there. Wow. Wow, guys.
I didn't want to.
So that was an activity that we can talk a little bit about how you could adjust this for current conditions. So if you were in a classroom and people were wearing masks and they were 6 feet apart, you can still do this. What you would have to do is make sure that you're being very explicit to students about what the expectation for their volume is, where they're standing, those types of things. One thing that's really interesting about this video that I really appreciate the way that it shows that while this is a whole group activity, you'll notice if you could really hone in and be able to see everybody, there are some students who realize that they will not call out any number. And so it almost seems like they're not participating, but it's their way of participating. And so I say that to say that's also a skill that you can think in terms of how to teach that to students so that they can be successful with this. A couple of other things to remember. This is an activity that can be done virtually as well. You could use the chat box. You could have them type the number just using numbers. You could have them write the number out and see how far you could get. You could also have everybody turn their microphones on and just see what would happen if you did it that way. So there's a few ways to do this. What I do highly recommend is the Responsive Advisory Meeting book has just a plethora of activities that you can go in and start looking at and thinking in terms of how can I adjust this based off of my conditions. A little later on, you'll get access to a resource that we've been working on that's going to give you 10 days worth of responsive advisory meetings and morning meetings that also will go through and tell you if you're going to do this activity, here's how you adjust it for virtual, here's how you would adjust it for being in the classroom. And so with that said, we're going to close out both the morning meeting and the advisory piece. But before we do, going back and thinking in terms of that core belief and thinking about when Jane set the stage for this whole conversation, and we've talked so much about the big umbrella competencies and then the skills that are associated under that. A couple of key takeaways to remember here. Always think in terms of what are the skills that are needed for the activity that I'm about to do. And that's true both academics as well as if you were doing morning meeting or responsive advisory meeting. A couple of other things that we want to just kind of share with you. First off, be patient with yourself. This is a new environment for both you and your students. There's going to be some anxiety for both you and your students, and there's going to be some mistakes that are going to be made, and that's okay. And just being patient with yourself and recognizing that that those things are going to happen, and that's okay. And just what are the takeaways? What can be learned from those pieces sometimes? Think big time about those skills. Make sure that you're being very transparent with those. And then the last piece is just when you're doing some of these activities, remember they're intended to be something that creates camaraderie and connections and strengthens skills. And so while maybe they don't go exactly like you expected them to, just roll with it, keep going with it, see what comes of it, and then talk with your students. What is working, what is not working, and they will tell you, because that's such an important piece, just to seek information from them, because they oftentimes have ideas on how to make something such as the number game that you just saw work for whatever circumstance that you have. And so seeking that type of information from your students can be critical. And I did see in the chat box where people started to do the number game. So it is there is so many different ways to adjust these, but I do recommend the responsive advisory meeting book because it'll give you so many of the activities. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Jane.
So what we want to do, and I want to kind of give you a sense of how we're going to bring our time together to a close. The first thing we're going to do is take a moment to look at two different components, one of morning meeting and one of this responsive advisory meeting. And thinking about the content we shared with you, being able to think, okay, this is the greeting, or this is the welcome and arrival welcome. How might I adjust this for my space? And then what we're going to do afterwards is give you a chance to kind of process that, think through that piece, and then you'll have an opportunity to then ask questions. And we're going to point you to some really helpful resources that are going to help you think specifically about how you might adjust things for a virtual or an in-person setting or both. So the first thing we're going to do is take specifically a look at the greeting component in morning meeting. And we're also going to take a look at arrival welcome. And we're going to look at those two pieces with this question in mind. So keeping the goals in mind. So knowing that you want to create a space in which students feel a sense of belonging, where students feel significant, where everyone feels included and students are seen and heard. If that's at the forefront of your mind, how might you adapt this particular component to keep your community strong and positive, but then also to ensure that students can be successful. So with this question in mind, we're going to take a look at a greeting in morning meeting in a kindergarten classroom. And this one, they're using the strike a pose greeting. And then we're going to look at arrival welcome in middle school and think about, if this is the question you're keeping in mind, how might you adapt it for your particular role and your setting? So with this question in mind, we're going to take a look at the greeting component, and we're going to look at arrival welcome.
I'm Miss Monkey.
Good morning, Miss Monkey. Ho. I'm Charlie.
Good morning, Charlie.
Ho. I'm Andre.
Good morning, Andre.
Ho. I'm Mason.
Good morning, Mason.
Ho.
It seems to me like everyone's remembering to pose after the greeting. So from now on, we'll just say good morning and then we'll show the pose. Go ahead, Graham.
I'm Graham.
Good morning, Graham.
Come on in. Hey, Leanne, make sure we're getting rulers and graph paper. Hey, Abby. Good morning, Shane. Thank you. Hey, Liam. Ruler and graph paper, please. Good morning, Jim. Thank you. Good morning.
And I think back to this question that started us looking at that greeting piece and also looking at the arrival welcome. So keeping the goals in mind, how might you adapt this particular component? So whether you focused mostly on the greeting or whether you focused on arrival welcome, or maybe you looked at both. Thinking about how you might adapt that component to build community and to ensure student success. I want you to just take a moment to think silently on your own about what you might do to meet students' needs and to adapt this particular component for your setting. Perhaps you came up with something where you thought to yourself, I hadn't considered doing a greeting like this. Or maybe you thought to yourself, when students come in, perhaps I'm going to do it in this way so that they know what to do when they get started, or I'm going to greet students as they enter in virtually, and this is how I'm going to get them started, and using that particular component to make sure that everyone has a sense of significance and that I've included everyone in my space. What we're going to do to have you bring everything to a closing space is we're going to have you think about this question, and then we're going to point out some resources and answer some questions to help us think more about this content. So here's the question we want you to think about. So considering what we've just discussed about how to keep those goals in mind, but then realizing that for your own unique space, you're going to know it better than we do. And even though you might say, well, I'm like for everyone, hasn't taught in this way, in this manner, in this situation, this is an unprecedented time for everyone, you probably have some sense of your grade level or your building or your classroom community, where you can think to yourself, okay, I can see how I might adapt this or I might change this because it works best for my students. So considering all that we've discussed with you, what's one word or a short phrase, maybe 3 words, that you might say to illustrate some of the key takeaways for yourself? And so you're going to use the chat box to put that one word or those few words into the chat box. And if you're commenting through Facebook, you can do it through the comments and put your one word or your one phrase there. Seeing lots of similar thoughts about being flexible, making sure you create this sense of belonging for all students, creating a really strong community. The importance of building relationships and making connections, and really helpful advice. Hmm. If you've posted something in comments or you've posted in the chat box, take a moment and look at what other people have posted for that one word or that short phrase, and you'll see that there's a lot of things that people have said that you may connect with or also resonate with you as well. What Joe and I want to do is be able to give you additional resources to help you continue to think about keeping the goals at the forefront, no matter what the situation is, whether it is virtual or in person. And so we're going to point out a few resources, including the opportunity to stick around for the last few minutes to ask questions or just to listen to responses. So just a few things to keep in mind, some resources for a morning meeting. Some of the resources that you can use with the morning meeting book or the activities or greetings books or the smaller spiral bound books. So it'll give you some ideas to look at. So if you've been doing morning meeting for a while, you might think to yourself, okay, let me look at some of the things that maybe aren't usually in my repertoire of pieces or components I usually use. And so I'm going to try out some different things and see how this works best in a virtual community. Or I'm going to see how this works best in a community that's distanced. Or if you're thinking about responsive advisory meeting, you might be thinking about some of these resources. And as Joe pointed out earlier, these are some helpful resources that you can connect to and just kind of spend some time digging into to think specifically about the purposes and how you can support children in building those relationships, realizing that this allows for that space for that to happen. And so those are some resources that you can take a look at that will help support that. For both responsive advisory meeting and also morning meeting, there are 2 free resources that you can find on our website at responsiveclassroom.org. And these 2 resources are very unique in that they are specifically for teaching or using morning meeting or using responsive advisory meeting in the midst of COVID. And so it's specifically, thank you, Karen, for putting that link in the chat box so that you can look at the first 10 days and knowing that you're going to see specific tips about what to do if you're doing this in person and how you can do specific components if you're doing this virtually, and then maybe how you combine the 2 to make that work. So you'll have 10 experiences for morning meeting at all different grade levels, as well as responsive advisory meeting. And so this is a free resource that you can just access on the website and take a look at and look at how you can best use it for your particular situation. And again, that link is in the chat box so that you're able to access that easily. In addition to this, there's other resources that you can purchase that I don't believe they're out yet, but if you're starting to think about, I want to really create an environment where all students feel welcome, and specifically thinking about how to keep at the forefront of your mind the idea of equity in your classroom. These 3 quick coaching guides are really helpful resources that you can consult to help you think about those pieces and keeping the community a welcoming space for all your students.
Jane,
Yes.
if I may, I just wanted to draw everyone's
Absolutely.
attention to the chat box for just a quick moment, because Karen has posted the link
Yes.
for the 10 days worth of lessons that you can sign up for. So I just wanted everybody to get that, to draw your attention to that.
Thanks, Joe.
You're welcome.
And then you'll also, one other place where you can find additional resources if you are just thinking about how to best plan for your students. Additionally on the website, and this is also free, the same location where you will find those 2 free resources for morning meeting in the midst of COVID and responsive advisory meeting also in the midst of COVID. You'll see under educator resources, there's a place to find planning guides and graphic organizers so that they are writable. You can type directly on them, or you can download them, or you can print them, whatever way works best for you. So you can plan out morning meeting and you can plan out responsive advisory meeting so that you'll be able to kind of really specifically think through your unique situation and also just your specific students and their needs. And then finally, Joe and I are always available to answer additional questions if you wanted to do that privately. This is your way to get in touch with Joe and myself, you can email us and we can answer questions that way. And then you can also visit the website to find out more information on some of the areas and topics that we've shared with you today. But what we want to also be able to do, maybe you're thinking to yourself, I have some questions, or maybe you posted it in the chat box and we missed it in the midst of all of the other responses that came up. So you are very welcome to stick around and ask questions or just listen to responses. And then if you feel like this is a good stopping place for you, you are also welcome to depart, and we thank you for being here with us. So we're going to give you the opportunity to decide if you're going to hang out and hear questions and responses, or if this is a time where you might go do some things independently on your own. The way that Joe and I are going to handle questions, whether they come through Facebook or whether they are here in this Zoom space, is that we have somebody on the end of Facebook who will help us manage the questions on that end. And then here in the Zoom room, if you have a question that you want to ask, you can click on the participants feature, and then you'll notice that in participants, you have the option to use the raised hand feature. And you can use the raised hand feature to ask questions. And that way we can respond to your questions that way. And you're more than welcome to stick around and just hear responses to questions as well. Let me see, we have some questions already. Robert, if you'll unmute and share your question.
Yeah, hi. Actually, my name is Nikki. I'm
sorry.
No. It says
Hi,
Robert
Nikki.
because that's on my husband's computer. Before I ask my question, I just want to say how much I've appreciated this and thank you, because I'm leaving with great ideas, not just for my students, but how to run parent meetings. So thank you to that for the format.
You're very welcome.
I'm not sure if you
us.
have what the answer to this will be. But I'm sure all educators here have criers, especially in the beginning of school.
Oh,
and
yes.
One thing that just sort of breaks my heart is thinking about those first early days when I'm used to hugging, consoling, holding hands, wiping tears. What advice and you may have on how to deal with that?
You know what, I had asked some other educators about that, because that is definitely something where I remember being able to console students when they're upset and give them hugs when they're upset. But I will share with you what other educators have told me that they are thinking about, and they considered this school-wide and not just, within a classroom, was coming up with, what do I call them? What do you call them? Cues or motions or movements that mean ways that they can connect with students, and teaching them that firsthand on the very first day, doing things like, doing things like this to show students that that you're thinking about and that you care for them, recognizing that it is really, I think, not only is it hard for the students, it's hard for us too, because we want to be able to give a child a hug when they're really sad. And we want to be able to hold a child's hand and guide them to a place where they are feeling unsafe or they're just not comfortable, especially when I think about our students who are just starting school, like pre-K and kindergarten, where this is a new experience for them altogether. And so that's really, really challenging and difficult. Another teacher suggested to me that they are allowing for children to have a
stuffed animal.
Yes, what do you call those stuffy things? A stuffy, yes. To have close by so they can have something that they hold or they hug or they can fidget with or have close by to kind of alleviate some of those feelings, and then acknowledging that they're allowed to have those feelings. It's really sad, and I want to be able to do this for you. And so one thing I'm going to allow for you to do, or a few things that I'm going to allow for you to do, is, do you feel like this is a time for you to pull out your stuffy and be able to hold them? Or do you feel like this is a time that if I just talk to you or say, and this other teacher, she sings, I do not sing. She was like, I have songs that I sing to my students. And I was like, that's amazing. If you can sing, then that would be something that can console children as well. Yeah. But I completely hear you, because that is difficult. And it's something I think as educators, especially of younger children, that's a part of the way that we connect with them. And it's challenging because that's now a part that we don't have access to, and it's not as easy. But those are just a few things that I'd heard from other educators.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Gina, I see your hand if you'll unmute and share.
So Jane, you just used some really beautiful language when you were talking about the core beliefs. You used equitable and I heard it of you, but it was so beautiful.
Remember. Thanks,
If you
Gina.
do, would you mind just messaging me?
Sure.
Because I just loved, as we move forward with some of the work we've been doing, I just love the way you put that. And even though it stood out to me so much, I can't remember what that second word was.
Is it inclusive? Is that the word you're looking for?
Was it equitable and inclusive? I think it was, Joe. You're right.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for
I put
listening.
accessible, but that wasn't right. Thank you guys so
Thanks.
much. This was wonderful. I
Thanks,
so appreciate
Gina.
both of you.
Thank you, Gina. And Michelle, thank you for putting that in the chat box about connecting with families so that they can also help prepare their younger students who, this is going to be challenging for them, so that they can have some background to be able to jump into a space that's different and be able to feel successful and also feel cared for at the same time. Katie, I see your hand if you'll unmute.
Hi, thank you so much for all the information. I just had a quick question about the difference between morning meeting and the responsive advisory meeting. I understand the components of each, but they do seem rather similar. Could you explain to me like when to use either one?
Yes, Joe, do you want to take this one or do you want me to take this?
So one of the biggest differences is in the morning meeting, the teacher is doing a lot of the guidance. Whereas in the advisory meeting, what we're asking is for students to take on a lot of the responsibility, even down to the degree that at sometimes students will lead the conversation and the role of the educator will shift to just simply being a moderator to make sure that no unkind words are spoken, those types of things. But that's the biggest piece of it. The similarities and the parallels are very strong simply because the overarching groundwork is the same. One of the other key differences is that it can be done at different times in the day, so therefore it's not in the morning. And then the other piece comes in the fact that these may not be students that you have all day long. It may not be students that, in some cases, it may not be students that you have at all for what you are assigned to teach from a content perspective. And so those are just a few of the key differences. Jane, do you want to add any?
Thanks, Joe, because those are really important key differences that separate the two. And then also morning meeting is typically what we use in elementary. And just because it's developmentally appropriate for elementary students, and you can imagine how responsive advisory meeting is more developmentally appropriate for middle school students, just by the nature of it and how it's set up. And exactly what Joe said, you don't see these students. Typically in elementary classrooms, you have the same students all day for the most part. And so starting the day that way, whereas with middle school, it's almost like you're creating almost like a cohort. Is that right, Joe? And you can tell me if that's incorrect. And so it creates that safe space where students are now able to facilitate, and the teacher becomes kind of the coach in that role, and not so much as the teacher leading it, which is what happens with morning meeting.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Katie.
And I just to add one quick thing, I think that the developmental considerations are really, really important. And so that's why, we look at it from the perspective of younger students typically need a different type of developmental piece versus the older students. So,
yeah.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks for pointing that out, Joe. I'm going to make sure we don't miss any questions. And I don't see there. Amy, if you'll unmute, I see your hand.
Hi. Oh, I'm trying to, could we use in the middle school, could you do both a morning meeting with your homeroom students, but then later on during the day, do more of a content related advisory type meeting? If you wanted to, especially during this period of time, maybe because we're going to focus more like for the first 3 or 4 weeks on building relationships.
Yes.
in our school, so, or in our district. So if we wanted to start with a morning meeting in all of our classes, and then as the day continued, have separate, more advisory type meetings, content more related, but because we're content teachers, is that appropriate? Could we do that?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, and if I'm not, jump in and correct me.
Too much.
Yeah. So I think the simple answer to your question is you could do an advisory meeting with middle school students in the morning, and then you could also do an advisory type meeting with your content-based classes to create communities within that third period math class that you have. And I think that that can be completely appropriate. The difference is the purpose of an advisory meeting is for it to be a period of time that is set aside where those 4 components are done from start to finish, so that those skills and those conversations that are maybe not academic based or standards based can still happen, and you can strengthen those relationships and those skills.
Okay. So
Does that answer what you're asking?
yeah. So, but if we wanted to call it to differentiate, like we could call it a morning meeting in the morning, and then more of an advisory throughout the day. That way it separates them completely.
If I was using middle school students, I would call it a RAM in the morning. I would call it an advisory meeting in the morning, and then I would just I would say that, you know, you could call it something to the degree of building communities within content.
Okay.
And so, but I would stick to the time that you've set aside to do those 4 components. I would suggest that you call that an advisory meeting.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just so I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. Vicki, I see your hand. If you'll unmute and share.
Hi.
Hi.
So my question is, I teach, but I am also, I run a lot of the professional development with the K through 8 teachers. And pretty much, aside for some new teachers here and there, everybody's pretty familiar with a responsive classroom. My question is, starting off the year, as I'm planning what to do with everyone, everything keeps coming into my brain, like, wait, we have to talk about this, we have to talk about that, you know, tone of voice and language and different challenges, and what are some strengths that we do have that we can still use, and like there's a million things. So my question is, what do you recommend to be the first focus so that I don't drive everybody crazy with what's going on inside my brain?
Because there's so many things and there's so many places to focus. You know, when you first asked your question, the first thing I thought about is I would probably want to know, because it would look different almost at each grade level, what's going to be the focus. Because if I think about your kindergartners and those teachers who are teaching kindergarten, there are some things that are probably really important for them to focus on first, as opposed to maybe your 8th grade teachers, where there's something different that they may need to focus on. And the first thing I thought of is probably either hearing from teachers, like what are some things that you introduce right away that these, that are like the first 2 or 3 things that you introduce. And then looking at where you have commonalities amongst all the grade levels and saying, okay, it looks like everyone's thinking about this first, or from K through 3, they're thinking about this first. So it may look different across different grade levels. And then the things that are more school-wide. So whether it's, if you're in person, are you in person or both, or virtual?
We're in person for now.
Okay, so
and when I just to clarify that, not that I'm asking you right now to give me all of this, but just to clarify, when I work with the teachers, it's in smaller groups, so it's not like I'm addressing everyone at once.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you for clarifying. So I think, to me, I think what would be important is figuring out how to create how to set it up so that when students come in, that immediately they feel comfortable and they know what they're supposed to do, because it's not like any other year. So it may be, so for when people walk in, or what your teaching students right away is, I know for me at the beginning of the year was, this is where you hang up your bag, and this is, and maybe that doesn't happen on the first day. Maybe it's, they go straight to their space and they talk about like, this is how you sit in your space, or this is how your space will look, and this is how you stay in your space, because it's different. And so it may be just thinking about what is always the same and what will remain the same, and going over those, and then what is going to be different and really critical so that they can be successful with all the other pieces that are usually the same. So I think I'd probably start there. So maybe brainstorming a list. I don't know if that's very helpful, but that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Vicki. I'm seeing we have a couple more hands, and I'm also noticing, Joe, how are we with time?
We might have time for a couple more. We're
Okay.
running a little bit over, and so we want to respect that. So,
Yes.
you know, at this point, if you need to jump off, we respect that. But for those of you that may still have questions, I think Jane,
We're here.
to stick around a few more minutes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Jessica, if you'll unmute and share, please.
Hi, first, thank you so much. This was very, very helpful.
You're very welcome. Thanks for joining us.
We are actually starting with a blended, so there's like some of the kids are going to be fully remote, and others will be coming into school. And so maybe I'm just being hopeful and putting it out in the universe, but at some point I would imagine that we would reconvene as a class as a whole. And so I'm just thinking, maybe very prematurely, but I'm thinking, how do we build community when some of the children will never really actually see each other until so much later in the year, perhaps?
Right. And I will tell you what a teacher, I thought it was a pretty cool idea, and I hadn't considered it because I was thinking, how do we pull the whole class together? We have to do it together. But what this teacher and their team decided was that they actually create two different pods. And so they have their virtual pod and making that community very strong. And then they have their in-person pod and making that community very strong. And then when they bring the group together, and their hope is the same, that they'll get to bring everyone together, it's like almost like a restart. So now we've got this new community, and now creating a new pod with your virtual and your in-person. So then now you have a new class, as opposed to, we're going to merge the two, but almost like the first day of school again, if that makes sense. So that you're creating a new climate and a new environment for both groups to exist together as one whole group. And when that person had shared that that's what their team is doing, I was like, that is actually a helpful way so that students can still have that sense of community and belonging somewhere, whether it is their virtual classroom community or their in-person classroom community. So it's just one way that I heard somebody share that they may allow for the two communities, and then for the two communities to come together.
Now that you're saying that, I think that I want to look up some picture books perhaps that talk about how maybe families grow, or how together, that when that does happen, we could launch with like that type of read aloud.
It's a clever idea, so I'm going to spread that around the next time. Mary Catherine, is that right?
Yes, thank you. So
Hi.
I was trained in responsive classroom about 11 years ago, and it has become my heart and soul. It has totally organized my method of teaching and thinking and education. My question is that I usually follow the first 6 weeks of school and the integration of the different parts of the morning meeting. And this year, the 4th graders coming to me in 5th grade did not have morning meeting last year. So I don't want to be overwhelming them by introducing it. Would you suggest taking a little more time? Because we are fully remote this year.
Okay. You know what I would actually suggest is using the resource sets online, because it's set up to gradually get into the idea, like picking very low risk things so that students can start to engage in morning meeting. So very simple pieces where you'll be able to implement them. And then once they start to feel comfortable with the format of morning meeting, and since you're already very familiar with morning meeting, then you'll be able to embed some of those other pieces that you know are really going to support those fourth graders as you're working with them. But that might be a good place to start to gently roll out morning meeting in a way that will be comfortable for them when they're virtual.
Right, because they're already going to be overloaded with everything.
Of course.
Virtual. I want to make
Of
sure
course.
giving them time. Thank you very much for today.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. All right. Joe, how are we looking? I think is that it? Is that all the questions?
I don't see any other hands. So I guess last call.
Sorry, Deborah asked a question on the chat, and it's a technical question about the morning meeting 10-day download. So just because I was going to print it right now too, so I want to make sure.
Yes. And your question was about, I'm trying to scroll and I keep missing it.
Says the morning meeting first 10 days download will not save. Also, if you try to print the second grade level, it will not let me. Are we only allowed to print one grade level?
That is a great question. And I have to be honest, Karen, are you there?
Yes, I'm not sure that, I think that once you're signed in, you can always go in there and view them, but I don't think they are printable or downloadable. They're there to access as a resource.
Thanks, Karen.
But once you've signed in, you don't need to sign in anymore. You'll have them. You can always just tab it and put it on a favorites tab and just link back to it.
Thank you, Karen. Sarah, if you'll unmute, I see your hand.
Hey, sorry. I have a lot of.
And before Sarah,
wait, which Sarah? Sorry.
No, you are Sarah.
I want to let you know. So I'm corrected. I stand corrected. They're not. You can print them. You just can't save them. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
Sarah.
Okay, Sarah.
You disappeared, Sarah.
Sorry, it's chaos here. I apologize.
That's okay.
Okay, honey. Okay, sorry. We just had a derecho hit Iowa, and we are destroyed. So most of our people that come here. Look, you're on TV. Look, you're on TV praying. Anyways, I see that it's being recorded, but how do we access the recording for all of my friends who can't make it due to power outage?
And oh, that's right, because there's some people who that happened for. And if you registered for this, I believe you will get an email in a week or so, and you can get the link to the recording if that's correct, Karen.
Perfect.
The recording should. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Sarah.
I missed half the meeting because I didn't realize it was Eastern time, and then
the recording and the link for all the resources and all that will come in an email tomorrow. So everything, if you didn't get a chance to save the link from the download, or if you kind of were in and out of the meeting, all the recording of the session and the resources will be sent to every single person who registered.
Thank you so much, Karen. Annie?
Hi, sorry, I know that I'm dragging this out, but somebody brought up the first 6 weeks of school, and while this is wonderful, I'm really panicked about the first 6 weeks of school virtually.
Completely
guided
understand.
Discovery, all of that.
Wait, I did not let you ask your question, I apologize.
That's it, that's what I'm wondering about. What are your recommendations for the first 6 weeks of school for virtual learning?
And Jane, if I can jump in with that, the one thing that we check our website, because this is some other questions come up about take a break and some other things, and one of our goals is actually to be with everyone through the first 6 weeks. So this is the beginning of a series. Next week, you have the opportunity to join a webinar about classroom organization. There's then going to be one about teacher language and teacher leadership style, some things to think about. Following that, there'll be one about skills, like what are some specific skills you're seeing that we need to model, how a chance to share a network and kind of think about those skills. So we're really trying to walk you through and be here with you step by step and provide resources for the first 6 weeks. Following that, we'll be thinking about rules. You know, like we may want to start our year with some like established rules just to kind of get through. But then, like, how can we start doing some hopes and dreams once we're in there? And then we'll be moving through to really support, you know, building learning communities and what academic learning is going to look like, and then also those unique challenges. So if I have students who are struggling with online response, so all those different components of the first 6 weeks, we would just be checking your emails and checking those different things. All those webinars will be getting released. We kind of started you out with a few couple this week and next week to get going. And then I will say that those are paid opportunities, but we are providing those, and they're very affordable.
Awesome.
But just those are opportunities for you to have some support systems through this whole for 6 weeks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Karen. All right. I think that's all our questions. If you do find that you have additional questions, you can always email Joe or myself. Our email is our first name, so joe@responsiveclassroom.org or jane@responsiveclassroom.org, and we're happy to answer questions that way.
Yeah, Jane, if I can,
Go ahead.
Kind of based off of that last question and stuff, that's the thing that we want everybody to understand is we're here. We understand this is a journey. We understand that there's going to be things that are going to pop up, and you're trying to adjust something to make it work or to make it fit, or you're having an issue. Just shoot us an email. Jane and I don't know everything, but we would be happy to put you in touch with the experts that do, because there's, I mean, you know, right now there's 100 and something people on this particular call, and you know, everybody's an expert in something, and so we'll be happy to work with you on those things. So you're not alone.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. All right, so with that, we want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for sticking around. We want to honor your time and make sure that you can take care of everything else that you need to take care of. So thank you for joining us. And with that, have a good evening and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.